lawyers. What's the moment you realized I can't defend this person? And story 1. I'm a criminal defense attorney and one case still haunts me. A man came to me in his 40s facing serious charges for a string of armed robberies. He seemed genuinely remorseful at first, constantly talking about how he just got caught up in the wrong crowd. I'll admit, I thought I could help him. He said he was a changed man, trying to turn his life around after a difficult childhood. It sounded plausible, even if it was hard to fully believe. A couple of weeks into representing him, we were sitting down for our pre-trial meeting when I received a bombshell. I had just received an email from a family member of his, anonymously, stating that the man I was defending was still actively involved in the same criminal network. This family member even provided recent photos of him at various crime scenes. I asked him about it in our meeting. At first, he denied everything, but as I pressed, the truth came out in bits and pieces. He was still participating in robberies. His rehabilitation was all a lie to buy time for his defense. That moment hit me hard. Not only had I been lied to, but I realized I had been defending someone who was actively committing the crimes he was accused of. I told him that I could no longer represent him. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. This wasn't just a case of bad choices. It was a calculated effort to manipulate me into helping him avoid consequences for his ongoing actions. I walked away from that one and realized that no amount of good behavior talk could justify continuing to defend someone so deceitful. Story 2. As a family law attorney, I never imagined I'd reach the point where I'd have to walk away from a client. But one case forced me to reconsider everything I knew about personal ethics. A mother came to me for help. She was in the middle of a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband. Her claims were that her ex was abusive and unfit to be a parent. She wanted full custody of their 2 children, and her case seemed straightforward. I believed her, at least at first. The evidence supported her claims, and we built a strong case for her side. However, as the proceedings went on, something strange started happening. She began to get more and more aggressive with her accusations. It wasn't just about the ex-husband anymore. She was now alleging that her children were scared of him and were suffering psychological harm from just being near him. Then came the bombshell. A therapist she had brought in to provide testimony was shown to have never even met the kids. The therapist was someone she had just known from a church, and I realized she'd been fabricating evidence. The lies were getting worse, and I felt sick to my stomach. After much internal struggle, I met with her and confronted her. I told her I couldn't represent someone who was not only lying but attempting to manipulate the court and her own children. She immediately tried to justify her actions, claiming it was all in the name of protecting her kids. That's when I realized she was too far gone in her own delusion to see what was happening. I withdrew from the case immediately. It was heartbreaking to turn my back on a client, but I had to protect my integrity and my profession. I still think about that case, and I hope those children are better off now. Story 3. It was one of my first cases as a public defender. A young man, around 19 years old, was arrested for assaulting a police officer during a protest. He came to me with a story about how he had been wrongfully accused, claiming he was only there to speak his mind peacefully and was caught up in a riot by accident. At first, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. We went over the evidence, which seemed thin, but there was one glaring issue. His story kept changing. One day, he said he had been pushed into the officer. The next, he claimed the officer attacked him first. Then, it came out. He had multiple prior convictions for violent behavior. And the more I dug, the more I realized that this guy had been part of several riots and had a history of escalating aggression when confronted with authority. The final straw came when I found out that he had been caught on video, clearly instigating violence and encouraging others to attack officers. His calm, self-righteous demeanor during our meetings completely contradicted what was on the footage. The anger I felt wasn't just about the lie. He was actively putting everyone around him in danger, including me. I couldn't, in good conscience, continue defending someone who had no interest in reform or justice. I withdrew from the case, and it was a hard lesson in the dangers of seeing only what you want to see in a client. Story 4. I work in civil litigation, specifically business disputes, and I had this one client who was a real piece of work. He owned a small tech startup and came to me for help in suing a former partner who he claimed had stolen trade secrets. The problem was, from the very beginning, he started contradicting himself. He'd say one thing in a meeting, then a few days later tell me something completely different. It started with small inconsistencies, nothing too alarming. But when the discovery process began, I realized that his entire case was based on fabrications. He claimed that his former partner had signed non-disclosure agreements, but I found out the document he was using me to intimidate and financially drain his former partner. This wasn't a case of protecting intellectual property or business rights. It was personal vengeance wrapped up in legal jargon. When I confronted him about it, he didn't even deny it. Instead, he made it clear that the outcome didn't matter to him. He was only in it to ruin someone's life. At that point, I realized I couldn't continue defending this man who had no regard for the ethics of the legal system. I withdrew from the case and the client seemed unfazed, as if it were just another obstacle in his revenge plot. It was a tough decision, but I realized there are some clients you just can't help. Story 5. I've been practicing personal injury law for over a decade, but one client stands out as the reason I had to reconsider my approach to cases. A woman came to me after being involved in a minor car accident. She claimed she had suffered severe back and neck injuries, and I could tell she was in pain. We filed a claim and gathered the medical reports, but over time, something didn't feel right. She would exaggerate her symptoms when we were preparing for court, but when I saw her out in public, she was walking around like nothing was wrong. I asked her about it, and she said it was just to make the case stronger. It became clear that she was fabricating most of her injuries. Not only that, but I found out she had a history of making similar fraudulent claims. The final blow came when she tried to get me to doctor some of her medical records to make her case appear more severe. At that point, I realized that this was no longer a matter of helping someone get fair compensation. It was about enabling fraud. I had to drop her as a client. As much as it hurt to walk away from a potential payday, I couldn't risk my reputation or the integrity of the legal profession for someone who was willing to lie for personal gain. I've been more cautious in vetting my clients ever since, and that experience taught me that sometimes the case just isn't worth it. Story 6. I'm a corporate lawyer, and I once found myself in a situation where I had to step away from a case, and it was a decision that shook me to my core. I was hired by a fast-growing tech company to defend them in a legal dispute with a smaller rival, claiming intellectual property theft. The company I represented was a titan in the industry, so naturally the stakes were high. My client, the CEO, was an ambitious woman who seemed to have everything together. At first, it was just business as usual. Contract disputes, confidentiality agreements, a few emails here and there. But then things took a darker turn. As I started looking into the evidence, it became clear that the smaller company had some legitimate claims. The CEO's company had been using tech that looked remarkably similar to a product developed by the rival. In fact, it seemed like the only difference was the branding. I didn't bring this up at first. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, during a meeting, the CEO casually admitted that they'd borrowed some of the rival's technology to speed up development. She said that in the fast-paced world of tech, sometimes you have to do what it takes to stay ahead. It was a stark moment of realization. I wasn't defending a company fighting an unjust accusation. I was defending a blatant act of theft. At that point, I had to ask myself, was I going to help cover up a corporate crime for the sake of profits and personal advancement? I told the CEO that I couldn't continue with the case, that I wouldn't represent a company that was willing to steal from others to get ahead. She was furious, but I knew I'd made the right choice. I walked away, and although I lost that client, I gained something much more valuable, my integrity. Story 7. I'm a defense attorney, but I've never had a case quite like the one that made me want to walk away. It was a murder trial, something I don't usually take on. The defendant was a man in his 30s, accused of stabbing his roommate after a dispute over money. On the surface, it seemed like a tragic yet straightforward case. He was facing life in prison if convicted, and my job was to try to reduce the charges or get him a lighter sentence. From the beginning, he seemed to show some remorse for his actions, and his defense was that it was an act of self-defense. He claimed that his roommate had been the aggressor, that he only acted in fear for his life. The trial was dragging on, and I felt confident that we could make a case for self-defense. But then, something completely unexpected happened. A surprise witness came forward, a friend of the victim who had been present during the altercation. What they said completely changed the trajectory of the trial. They testified that the defendant had planned the attack in advance, even showing up at the victim's apartment with a knife in. The worst part? My client confirmed he admitted that he had orchestrated the entire thing because he was tired of his roommate's constant complaining and wanted to take control of their shared living space. I was stunned. This wasn't a case of self-defense, it was premeditated murder. I confronted him about it, and he shrugged it off, almost as if it were no big deal. At that point, I knew I couldn't defend a man who was not only guilty but also completely indifferent to his actions. I withdrew from the case and immediately informed the judge. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but I had to hold myself to a higher standard than the lie my client was trying to sell. Story 8. I was a young attorney working as part of a team handling a class action lawsuit. The case involved a massive corporation accused of intentionally selling defective products, which resulted in injuries to several consumers. At first, it seemed like an open and shut case. The evidence was solid, and the plaintiffs were genuine. I was eager to make my mark and prove myself as a rising star in the legal world. However, the deeper I got into the case, the more I started to see things that didn't add up. The plaintiffs, while sympathetic, seemed to be exaggerating their claims. Some of them were exaggerating the extent of their injuries, and others were claiming damages they clearly hadn't incurred. One woman claimed her entire life had been destroyed by a product malfunction, but when I looked into her background, I found multiple instances of her filing similar claims against other companies. Another man, who said he had been seriously hurt, was posting pictures of himself running marathons on social media. I realized that we were getting involved in a class action with plaintiffs who had no intention of seeking justice. They wanted money, and they were willing to lie to get it. I had to ask myself, was I willing to defend these people and continue supporting a case that could damage my reputation? I spoke to the senior partners about the issue, but they were determined to press forward. That's when I made the decision to withdraw from the case. I couldn't, in good conscience, continue representing people who were abusing the legal system for financial gain. It was a tough call, but I walked away, and I've been much more careful about the cases I take on since then. Story 9. I used to represent a lot of tenants in disputes with their landlords. It was the type of practice that kept me busy but wasn't necessarily glamorous. One case, however, still sticks with me. It was a woman who came to me, claiming that her landlord was illegally evicting her from her apartment. She had been living there for years, paying rent on time, and she had a young daughter. She was terrified of losing her home. At first, everything seemed fine. The landlord was indeed in the wrong, and I was certain we could win the case. But as we started gathering evidence, I noticed something odd. She was extremely secretive about her finances. Every time I asked her for records of rent payments, she would give me vague excuses or delay. Eventually, after a few months, I discovered the truth. She hadn't been paying rent for over a year. In fact, she'd been using the money to fund a gambling addiction. She had lied about everything. I confronted her about it, and she broke down in tears, admitting that she had been using the legal case as a way to buy herself more time. She had been avoiding eviction by stalling, but all she was doing was digging herself deeper into debt. This wasn't just a tenant rights issue. It was a person refusing to take responsibility for their actions. I knew I couldn't continue to represent someone who was not only lying, but was actively making their own situation worse. I told her that I would withdraw from the case and that I could not continue to fight for someone who refused to face the truth. She didn't take it well, but it was the right decision. I walked away from that case, and it made me more cautious about taking on cases where the client wasn't being completely honest. Story 10. I work as a prosecutor, and one case I worked on made me question everything about justice. A man in his 50s was charged with assaulting his wife. The case seemed fairly straightforward. His wife had reported the assault, and there were medical records to corroborate the injury. My job was to build a case for conviction, and I was sure we would win. But as the trial went on, I started noticing that his wife seemed almost complicit. She was present in the courtroom, but she acted strange, almost like she didn't want her husband to be convicted. She was reluctant to testify and kept making excuses for his behavior. One night, she even showed up to the courthouse wearing a ring that matched the one he had been wearing when he was arrested. It didn't make sense. I spoke to her privately and learned the truth. She had been emotionally manipulated into pressing charges in the first place. Her family had convinced her that she needed to take a stand against him, but she didn't want to. She confessed that she had started the fight, not him. He had been trying to leave when she attacked him first, and he defended himself. She didn't want him to go to prison, but now she felt like she had no way out. At that moment, I realized I couldn't prosecute this case anymore. It wasn't that the defendant wasn't guilty. It was that this woman had been coerced into something she didn't want. I dropped the charges, and while it was a difficult decision, it was also a necessary one. That case taught me that justice isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's about understanding the full picture before making a call. Story 11. I'm a divorce lawyer, and I've been practicing long enough to have seen it all. But nothing prepared me for the moment I had to walk away from a client who seemed to have everything under control, at least on the surface. She was a successful woman in her late 30s with a high-paying job, and she seemed calm and collected as we discussed the details of her impending divorce. Her husband, on the other hand, was a high-profile executive, and their marriage had been rocky for years. She was determined to fight for full custody of their 2 children and a significant portion of his wealth. At first, it looked like the case was straightforward, but as we dug deeper into the details, I started noticing small inconsistencies in her story. She painted her husband as a negligent father, claiming that he was emotionally distant and sometimes physically harsh with the kids. As I began gathering evidence, I found something I wasn't prepared for. Her behavior during their marriage didn't line up with her accusations. The more I learned about her, the more it became clear that she had been controlling and manipulative toward her husband, not just in their marriage, but also in her dealings with the children. The turning point came when I received a letter from her husband's attorney. It contained recordings of private conversations between my client and the children, where she was coaching them on what to say about their father. It was gut-wrenching to listen to. She had been instilling fear in them, making them believe that they were in danger, when in reality, he had been a loving father all along. At that moment, I knew I couldn't represent her any longer. She had been lying to me, to her children, and to the court. When I confronted her about it, she denied everything, but I could see the coldness in her eyes. It was as if she was willing to destroy her family just to win. I withdrew from the case immediately, and though it was one of the hardest decisions I've made, I knew it was the only one I could make. I wasn't willing to be part of her toxic manipulation. Story 12. I'm a civil litigator, and I've had some difficult cases over the years, but one in particular stands out. A case where I had to walk away from a client who took advantage of my trust. The client was a small business owner who had hired me to help him sue a competitor for trademark infringement. He claimed that the other company had stolen his branding and was using it to confuse customers. On the surface, it seemed like a solid case, and he was adamant that he had been wronged. However, as the discovery process went on, I started to uncover something disturbing. The evidence didn't add up. The client had claimed that the competitor's branding was nearly identical to his own, but when I looked at the materials side by side, the similarities were minimal at best. In fact, some of his claims were completely fabricated. It seemed like the competitor's branding was distinct, and the only real similarity was a generic color scheme and font style, common elements in the industry. I confronted my client about the discrepancies, and he got defensive. He insisted that I make the case work, even if that meant stretching the truth. He told me that he didn't care about the facts, only about winning the lawsuit and hurting his competitor's business. He even suggested that I should try to coerce the other company into a settlement by using false evidence. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about intellectual property. It was about destroying someone else's livelihood based on greed and spite. I couldn't be part of that. I withdrew from the case and informed the court that I would no longer represent him. I wasn't going to risk my career for a case built on lies and manipulation. He was furious, but I couldn't stand by someone willing to destroy another person's business for the sake of personal gain. It was a harsh lesson in trust, and it made me rethink how I evaluate clients. Story 13. I'm a personal injury lawyer, and one case made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about representing clients. A woman came to me claiming that she had been severely injured in a car accident. She said that the other driver had run a red light and crashed into her vehicle, causing her to suffer serious back and neck injuries. She showed me medical records and everything seemed legitimate. I took her case and began preparing for the fight ahead. However, as we progressed, things started to unravel. The woman seemed to be recovering much faster than expected. She had initially described excruciating pain and limited mobility, but within weeks I noticed her posting photos on social media, showing her out and about, playing tennis, going on hikes, and even attending a wedding. When I confronted her about it, she said it was nothing to worry about and that she was simply feeling better. But the more I dug into her past, the more I discovered troubling patterns. She had a history of filing personal injury claims, many of which had been dismissed for exaggeration or outright fraud. In fact, she had once been caught in a similar scheme where she faked an injury to collect a settlement from another car accident. This time, I found out she was working with a network of doctors who were willing to falsify records and exaggerate her injuries. I couldn't continue representing her. It wasn't just that she was lying. It was that she was actively trying to defraud the legal system for her own gain. I had to inform her that I was withdrawing from the case, and it wasn't an easy conversation. She became angry, but I knew it was the only choice I could make. I couldn't put my name on a case that was based on lies. It was a sobering moment, and it made me much more cautious in choosing clients moving forward. Story 14. I work in intellectual property law, and one case almost made me walk away from my career entirely. A startup founder came to me seeking patent protection for a groundbreaking new product. He had developed a unique piece of technology that he was confident would revolutionize the industry. I was excited to take the case on, and everything seemed legitimate at first. The prototype was impressive, and the paperwork was solid. As we moved forward, the founder became increasingly demanding and secretive. He started insisting on controlling every detail of the case, often overriding my legal advice. He would refuse to let me speak to certain engineers working on the project, claiming that they didn't need to be involved. I started feeling uneasy about the direction the case was going, but I kept pushing ahead because I wanted to help the client. Then, one day, I found out that the technology he had patented wasn't his idea at all. I discovered that it had been stolen from a larger company and he had intentionally filed a patent for a piece of technology that had already been publicly disclosed. He wasn't an inventor, he was a fraud. He had stolen the idea, and now he was trying to profit off it. I was appalled. I confronted him, and he admitted everything, shrugging it off as a necessary evil. He told me that it didn't matter how the idea came about, as long as it would make him rich. At that point, I knew I couldn't continue with the case. I withdrew immediately and reported him to the authorities for intellectual property theft. It was a decision that cost me a lucrative opportunity, but it was one of the most important decisions I've ever made in my career. I walked away knowing I had done the right thing. Story 15. As a criminal defense attorney, I've represented a wide range of clients, but one case stands out as the moment I knew I couldn't defend someone anymore. A man came to me charged with assaulting a stranger in a bar. The evidence was damning. Witnesses, security footage, and even the victim's medical records all pointed to my client being the aggressor. At first, he insisted that it had been a misunderstanding, that he had acted in self-defense after the victim had provoked him. I started building the defense based on his claims, though something felt off. As we dug deeper, it became clear that his story wasn't adding up. More witnesses came forward, contradicting his account of the incident. Then, in a shocking twist, I discovered that my client had a long history of violent behavior. He had been involved in several altercations before, and this wasn't the first time he'd lashed out in a public setting. His record was full of incidents where he'd claimed self-defense, but the pattern was clear. He had a tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. What really pushed me over the edge was when I learned that he had been harassing the victim in the weeks leading up to the incident. It wasn't just a random attack, it was part of a pattern of bullying and intimidation that had gone on for months. He didn't want to just defend himself, he wanted to destroy this person. I couldn't represent him anymore. I told him I would no longer be his attorney, and I withdrew from the case. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I realized I could never defend someone who had no interest in truth, justice, or It was a wake-up call that reminded me of the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Story 16. I've been an estate planning attorney for over a decade, and I've always prided myself on helping clients prepare for the future and avoid unnecessary legal battles after their passing. Most of my cases are straightforward, setting up wills, trusts, and ensuring beneficiaries are taken care of. But one client, an elderly widow, pushed me to a breaking point where I knew I couldn't continue representing her. She was referred to me by a close friend, and at first everything seemed perfectly normal. She was in her late 70s, and her main concern was setting up a will to divide her estate among her 2 children, both adults in their 40s. She spoke highly of them, and seemed content with her decision to divide everything equally. Her estate was relatively modest, consisting mainly of her home and a few savings, so I didn't anticipate any drama. However, as we got deeper into the paperwork, she started becoming more secretive. She requested to meet with me privately, away from her children, which I thought was a bit unusual, but not entirely concerning at first. During this meeting, she revealed that she had secretly changed her mind and wanted to disinherit one of her children entirely. She claimed that her son had betrayed her trust years ago and had been taking advantage of her ever since. She wanted to leave everything to her daughter, with a small amount set aside for the son, who she stated didn't deserve a dime. While it's not uncommon for family disputes to arise in these cases, what troubled me was the way she spoke about her son. She seemed consumed with hatred and bitterness, and the more I listened, the more I realized how distorted her perception had become. She painted a picture of a son who had abused her for years, but when I spoke to her daughter, I learned that her son had simply been trying to help her with daily tasks after her health declined. No malice, just concern. The daughter was baffled by her mother's claims and described her as increasingly paranoid and irrational. I couldn't, in good conscience, help her carry out a plan that seemed to stem more from resentment and emotional manipulation than from reality. I gently informed her that I could no longer represent her if she insisted on cutting her son out of her will, especially when there were no grounds for such an extreme action. She became defensive and tried to argue, but I knew that the situation was beyond my ability to mediate. It was a difficult decision, but I withdrew from the case. I'm still haunted by how quickly family bonds can break down, and I often think about how sometimes helping people also means knowing when not to assist in harmful decisions. Story 17. I've worked as a public defender for years, representing clients from all walks of life. Most of the time, I do my best to help people navigate the criminal justice system, and I've had some clients with tough pasts who truly want to change. But there was one case that made me realize I could no longer keep defending a person who simply wasn't interested in rehabilitation. The client was a young man in his mid-20s, facing charges for possession with intent to distribute. He had been arrested with a large amount of drugs in his car, and the case against him was pretty solid. We had a lot of evidence on our side, but during the pre-trial meetings, He seemed oddly detached about the situation. Instead of focusing on the possibility of getting a reduced sentence or finding any avenue for rehabilitation, he bragged about his past criminal activities. He told me that he was just doing what it takes to survive and seemed almost proud of the fact that he had been dealing drugs for years. At first, I tried to engage him in a discussion about getting clean, about moving on from that lifestyle. But it quickly became clear that he didn't want to leave his life of crime behind. In fact, he seemed offended by the idea that he might have to give it up. He told me that his life was fine the way it was, that he was making good money and had a loyal net. He even said that if he got caught again, he wouldn't change a thing. It became obvious that he was only in it for the money and wasn't interested in any sort of redemption. He wasn't worried about the long-term consequences of his actions, nor did he care about the people affected by the drugs he was distributing. I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to represent someone who had no desire to take responsibility for their actions or make any effort to change. I withdrew from the case, explaining that I couldn't keep defending someone who wasn't ready to face the truth and make a meaningful change. It was a harsh moment for me, but it reinforced my belief that defense attorneys aren't just there to get people out of trouble. They're there to help guide them toward a better path when possible. In this case, I knew my client wasn't interested in anything other than continuing his harmful lifestyle. Story 18. As a real estate lawyer, I mostly handle transactions, contract disputes, and property issues. My clients are typically businesses, developers, and homeowners seeking legal guidance on buying or selling property. However, there was one case that involved a residential dispute, and it made me seriously reconsider my approach to some of my clients. The situation involved an elderly woman who came to me seeking legal action against a neighbor who she claimed was encroaching on her property. She was adamant that her neighbor had extended their fence onto her land, effectively cutting off a portion of her yard. At first glance, it seemed like a fairly straightforward property dispute, and I agreed to represent her, thinking we could reach a resolution quickly. However, as I began to review the details of the case and visited the property, I realized that things weren't as clear-cut as they appeared. Her accusations seemed to be based on a misunderstanding. The fence in question had been up for years, and the neighbor claimed it had always been in that spot. I checked the property deeds and survey maps, and everything pointed to the neighbor's fence being well within their legal boundaries. When I brought this up to the woman, she became agitated and refused to listen. She insisted that the neighbor was purposely stealing her land, even when presented with clear evidence to the contrary. As I spoke with her, it became apparent that her desire for conflict with the neighbor went beyond the fence. She was increasingly bitter and paranoid, believing that everyone around her was out to get her. She didn't care about the facts or the reality of the situation. She just wanted to escalate things. I tried to suggest alternative solutions, such as a friendly conversation with the neighbor, but she rejected every option that didn't involve legal action. It soon became clear that she wasn't seeking a resolution. She was using the legal system to fuel her personal vendetta. I realized I couldn't be part of this unnecessary conflict. I withdrew from the case, telling her that I couldn't represent her if she wasn't willing to engage in a productive way. It was a tough call, but I couldn't let her use my services to perpetuate an ongoing, baseless dispute. I walked away, and it made me more mindful of the emotional elements that sometimes drive clients to pursue cases that aren't rooted in reality. Story 19. I was working as a corporate lawyer at a mid-sized firm when a high-profile client came to me with a request that completely changed my perspective on the ethics of business law. The client was a multinational corporation that had recently acquired a smaller competitor, and they needed legal guidance to handle the transition. My job was to assist in drafting the legal documents for the merger, handle any disputes that might arise, and ensure that everything was above board. The situation quickly became complicated when I started uncovering some troubling details about the company's past. It turned out that the corporation I was working with had a history of underhanded business practices. They had been involved in price-fixing schemes, violating labor laws, and engaging in other unethical actions to crush competition. As I reviewed the merger documents, I found clauses that would strip the smaller company's employees of their rights and essentially create a monopoly in the industry. I raised these concerns with the executives, and they brushed me off, telling me it was all part of doing business in a competitive market. They asked me to find legal loopholes to help them avoid penalties for their past violations and to streamline the process of reducing their new workforce. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. I felt a pit in my stomach as I realized that I was being asked to assist in a blatant attempt to break the law for financial gain. At that point, I had to make a decision. I couldn't continue to represent a company that had no interest in following the law, much less adhering to any ethical standards. I withdrew from the case and left my position at the firm. It was a difficult decision because it meant giving up a lucrative career, but I knew I couldn't be part of a system that prioritized profit over integrity. It changed the course of my professional life, but I have never regretted it. Story 20. I'm an immigration attorney, and I had a case that made me question the very core of my practice. A young man came to me seeking asylum in the United States. He claimed that he was fleeing political persecution in his home country and needed help applying for refugee status. His story was compelling. He had been involved in activism, and he provided credible evidence of harassment by the government. I agreed to represent him, convinced that his case was legitimate. However, as the case progressed, I began to notice inconsistencies in his story. He claimed to have been the victim of violent threats, but the evidence he provided was either vague or questionable. He had photos of himself at political rallies, but they were taken in locations that didn't line up with the timeline of events he had provided. When I confronted him about these discrepancies, he became defensive and evasive. It was clear that his claims weren't as solid as I had initially believed. After further investigation, I learned that he had overstayed his tourist visa and was simply trying to avoid deportation. While he may have faced some mild discomfort in his home country, there was no indication that he had actually been persecuted or that he was at risk of harm. He had fabricated his entire story to avoid the legal consequences of his immigration status. I had to make the hardest decision of my career. I couldn't continue to represent someone who was lying to the system, knowing how much it would hurt legitimate asylum seekers. I withdrew from the case and informed the authorities of his falsehoods. It was a painful moment, but I realized that the integrity of the legal process mattered more than any single case. Story 21. I've been practicing law for nearly 2 decades, and I've had a wide range of clients, but one case stands out as the moment I knew I couldn't represent someone anymore. It was a high-stakes business dispute, and my client was a tech company looking to protect a patent. The company had been accused by a smaller startup of stealing its intellectual property, and we were tasked with defending the claim. At first, everything seemed legitimate. The patent seemed solid, and the evidence suggested that the smaller company's product did indeed infringe on my clients. But as we dug deeper into the case, I began to notice troubling things. My client, the CEO, was obsessed with winning the case at any cost. She would constantly push me to find ways to manipulate the timeline of the patent's filing and downplay any issues that could weaken our argument. In one meeting, she suggested that we adjust some of the records to make the case stronger. She wasn't asking for a small tweak. She wanted to falsify evidence to create a more favorable narrative. I was taken aback. I had always prided myself on being someone who respected the law and integrity, but here was a client pushing me to break those principles. When I confronted her, she was dismissive, almost as if it was normal to engage in such practices. It became clear to me that this wasn't about defending a legitimate patent. It was about taking down a competitor by any means necessary. I walked away from the case. I told her that I could no longer represent her because I couldn't participate in unethical practices, no matter the financial benefits. She was furious, but I knew it was the right decision. It was a harsh lesson, but it reinforced my belief that no case is worth sacrificing your integrity. Story 22. I've worked as a criminal defense attorney for years, and I've seen plenty of tough cases. However, one particular trial made me question everything I thought I knew about defending clients. A man came to me charged with assault after an altercation at a bar. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses, security footage, and the victim's injuries all pointed to him being the aggressor. But my client was insistent that he was acting in self-defense, and he begged me to represent him. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. It was possible that he had been provoked, and I thought I could build a defense around that. But as we went through the trial prep, the holes in his story started to become glaringly obvious. He was changing the details constantly. One minute he claimed the victim had swung at him first, and the next he said he had been attacked with a weapon. The inconsistencies were staggering, and I began to doubt his sincerity. The turning point came when I discovered that he had a history of similar violent altercations. Every time he was confronted, he escalated the situation. He wasn't just a man defending himself. He was a man who frequently instigated violence. I also found out that the victim had been a close friend of his. And this fight wasn't about self-defense. It was about years of pent-up anger and resentment. I had to face a difficult truth. I could no longer defend him. I sat him down and explained that I could no longer represent someone who was lying to me and to the court. His reaction was one of complete indifference, which further confirmed that he wasn't interested in justice. He just wanted to avoid the consequences of his actions. I withdrew from the case, and it was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, but it was also the right one. Story 23. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I once represented a company that prided itself on its sustainable practices. The client came to me claiming they were facing a lawsuit from a competitor who accused them of violating environmental regulations. They wanted me to help clear their name, and it seemed like a good case at first. The regulations in question were complex, and I thought I could help navigate the legal maze to prove that my client had done nothing wrong. As I delved into the case, however, I started uncovering something troubling. The company had been cutting corners in some areas, claiming they were using eco-friendly materials when, in fact, they were sourcing them from questionable suppliers. They had been reporting inflated numbers about their energy efficiency, and when I requested the documents, they gave me falsified reports. I dug deeper, and the truth became clear. They were trying to greenwash their operations for the sake of appearing environmentally conscious, while in reality they were doing more harm than good. I couldn't continue to represent a company that was deliberately misleading the public and violating environmental standards. When I confronted them, they acted like it was all part of business, shrugging off the ethical issues. I realized that their goal wasn't to resolve the issue. It was to avoid the legal consequences and keep up the facade of being a green company. I withdrew from the case immediately, informing them that I could no longer represent them. It was a painful decision because it meant walking away from a substantial fee, but my principles were far more important. In the end, it was a reminder that, as lawyers, we have a responsibility to not only our clients but also to the greater good. Story 24. I'm a family lawyer, and I had a case that made me seriously reconsider my role in the legal system. A woman came to me seeking help with a divorce from her husband, a man who had been emotionally and physically abusive. She was desperate for a fresh start and wanted to ensure that she received full custody of their 2 children. I believed her. She seemed sincere, and her claims were supported by the medical reports and statements from friends and family. However, as I dug deeper into the case, I began to see something troubling. She started manipulating her children against their father. At first, it was subtle. She would make comments about how their father was dangerous or crazy, planting seeds of fear in their minds. But as the case wore on, it became clear that she was intentionally turning her children into pawns in her fight for custody. She would coach them on what to say and made it clear that she expected them to testify against their father. One day, the oldest child came to me privately and confessed that they felt torn. They loved their father and didn't want to say the things their mother was asking them to. The child was clearly conflicted, and that's when I realized I was dealing with a woman who wasn't just trying to escape an abusive marriage. She was using her children as leverage to hurt her ex-husband. I couldn't be part of that. I informed her that I could no longer represent her if she continued with her manipulative tactics. She was furious, accusing me of being on her husband's side, but I knew I had made the right choice. I withdrew from the case, and while it was a difficult decision, it made me rethink my approach to family law. It's not just about winning. It's about doing what's best for everyone involved, especially the children. Story 25. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I was representing a man who had been wrongfully accused of assaulting a police officer during a protest. He came to me claiming that he had been peacefully demonstrating when the police targeted him and arrested him without cause. His story seemed plausible. There had been numerous reports of police brutality at the protest, and the footage from the event was murky at best. However, as I started to investigate further, I realized that my client's version of events didn't quite hold up. He had been part of the protest, but when I reviewed the security footage and spoke with witnesses, it became clear that he had been inciting violence. He wasn't just a passive participant. He had been encouraging others to get violent with the officers, even throwing objects at them. It wasn't self-defense, it was aggression. I was torn. On one hand, I believed in his right to free speech and peaceful protest. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that he had been an active instigator of violence. When I confronted him, he was unapologetic, claiming that the ends justified the means and that his actions were justified by the cause. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't continue defending him. I withdrew from the case, explaining that I could not represent someone who was deliberately escalating a situation and putting others at risk. It was a hard decision, but it reinforced the idea that defending civil rights doesn't mean condoning violence. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than a simple narrative, and I had to walk away from a case that no longer aligned with my values. Story 26. I'm a lawyer who has spent years specializing in real estate law, and while most of my cases are relatively straightforward, there was one that made me rethink my career entirely. The case began with a distressed client who was a young woman trying to get out of a particularly bad property deal. She had purchased a condo with a part, and shortly after moving in, she discovered that the building had severe structural issues, things that were not disclosed at the time of purchase. The case seemed simple enough. We could sue the developers for fraud and breach of contract. My client had the documents to prove that the developers had been hiding defects, and we had a clear case. But as we moved forward, something didn't add up. When I began speaking to my client's partner, I realized that there were discrepancies in her story. The partner claimed that she had known about the defects all along, but had been persuaded to go through with the deal because of my client's insistence on pushing ahead with the purchase. It turned out that my client had been more involved in the transaction than she had let on, and the real reason she wanted to get out of the deal was because the investment was rapidly losing value. She wasn't just trying to escape a bad deal. She was trying to take advantage of the situation to shift the blame to the developers. I confronted her about the inconsistencies in her story, and she admitted to exaggerating the facts, claiming that she had no intention of paying the full price for the condo if she didn't have to. She had used the legal system as a way to manipulate the outcome for her own financial gain. I couldn't represent someone who was willing to lie to me and to the court. I withdrew from the case immediately. It was tough because I knew my client was desperate, but I couldn't be part of something dishonest. This case taught me an important lesson. As a lawyer, your integrity is everything, and sometimes that means walking away from clients who are willing to cross ethical boundaries. Story 27. I've always been a staunch believer in the justice system, but there was one criminal case I handled that left me questioning whether I was really doing the right thing. The client was a man in his 30s who was accused of multiple robberies. The evidence against him was damning. Fingerprints on the stolen goods, surveillance footage showing him at the scene, and witnesses who could identify him. At first, I was determined to defend him, thinking maybe he had a good reason for his actions or was caught up in a bad situation. As the case progressed, however, I began to uncover some very troubling facts. My client kept changing his story, offering me different versions of events that didn't quite add up. One minute, he claimed he was a victim of mistaken identity. The next, he insisted that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, when the robberies took place. Then, during a private conversation, he confessed to me that he had committed the robberies, and worse, that he had done it as part of a pattern of behavior. It became clear that he wasn't interested in taking responsibility for his actions or showing any remorse. Instead, he was trying to manipulate the legal system to avoid facing the consequences. The final straw came when he tried to bribe a witness to change their testimony in his favor, which was the moment I realized I couldn't continue representing him. I immediately withdrew from the case, and though he was furious, I knew I had made the right decision. It was a tough situation to walk away from, especially with such a strong case against him. But I couldn't, in good conscience, defend someone who had no respect for the law or for the people he had hurt.